Advent preaching is a lot of fun. It's fun to do for a couple of reasons. One is because, as preachers know, Advent first of all means talking about the second coming of Christ, and so you usually get these really scary texts about, the heavens melting and everything falling apart and wars and earthquakes and Christ coming back. And it's not usually what people are expecting right after Thanksgiving is done and as they're starting to pull out the Christmas decorations and to hear these end of the world kinds of texts. So in that sense, it's fun because there's a bit of a surprise that Advent begins with this boom and some terrifying thoughts, but also it corrects our vision, again, to talk about what are we celebrating in Advent? What are we expecting as Christians? As Christians, we're a waiting people. We're people who believe that the best is still yet to come, even though God is taking us there. So Advent reminds us of that right away. And then you've got the movement towards Christmas and towards the expectation of the incarnation, which is what people were expecting Advent to begin with. But that's a great time to not just stand against the culture, right? To talk about that Advent is more than just singing the songs and doing the shopping and trimming the tree and all of that. But Advent is a kind of quiet expectation, introspection. That's all important stuff. But it's also great because of the texts that we get to look at. I love the Lucan infancy narratives, Luke chapter 1 and 2, and how they talk about the preparations for the Christ, or the expectations for Christ to be born. You've got no other passages like this in the New Testament, like Luke chapter 1 and 2. Luke wants us to understand Jesus as the fulfillment of all of this Old Testament expectation. Matthew does it in a particular way. Matthew will pause and say, all of this happened to fulfill the words of the prophet, which said, and then we'll cite a scriptural passage. Luke wants us to see the story of Jesus integrally woven into the story of the Old Testament. There's no break here. This is the same God. This is the next act in the biblical drama. And Luke does that by giving us people who are pious. Zechariah, who worships in the temple, his wife Elizabeth, Mary, these are all very pious people. We meet Anna and Simeon, who are expecting the Messiah, Anna, who never leaves the temple. Jesus comes to a world that's expecting him in Luke's gospel. Of course, it doesn't end that way, and when his ministry begins, we see conflict. But at least for this almost bizarre, almost fantastic moment, Jesus comes to a world that needs him, that expects him, and that is ready to praise God for him, for his coming. All of this around John's birth and Jesus' birth, knit together in a particular way, that tell us something about God's visitation. That's an important word for Luke, episcope, this idea of a visitation. Later on, Jesus will say that Jerusalem did not recognize the time of the Lord's visitation, but they recognize it in Luke 1 to 2. And so it sets our eyes for reading the entire Gospel of Luke, I think, in some ways, to ask, what kind of Messiah is this, and what is God going to do? Mary's going to talk about kingdoms being thrown down, and the hungry being filled, and the rich being sent away empty. Does that happen in the story? Is it just spiritualized? Or is this a bigger statement about who this God is that's behind the incarnation, and how this God operates, and how this is a God who is able to turn society upside down on its head, to invert all of our expectations about what's right or about what's proper? So in Luke 1 to 2, without getting too misty about Christmas, it directs our vision to both the simplicity and the beauty of this baby born in a manger, but also about this God who has power over governments and nations and the whole scope of human history. The terrifying aspects of Advent, right, of God becoming enfleshed in a human being, of God becoming so near that we can touch God, we can interact with God. There's something terrifying about that as well. And also something that's strangely beautiful and fragile. And Luke really helps us, gives us the language to explore that in ways that are quite touching, and I think also open our eyes to what the Bible has to say about who this God is from the Old Testament and then further on into the New.